Splinters in Time, The Time Bubble, Book 4. Written by Jason Ayres. Narrated by Karena Gregory. Prologue. October 2019. Josh was lost in the wrong time. Not only was it the wrong time, it was also the wrong universe. He didn't even know which the right universe was anymore. Clutching the damaged wand-like device in his hand, he was stumbling from one version of reality to another, through time bubbles he could no longer control, desperate to find a way home. Powered only by the kinetic energy of the Earth's rotation, his malfunctioning device was sending him further and further back in time, and increasingly distant from home. Nicknamed the tachyometer in homage to an old time travel movie, the adventure it had sent him on had gone decidedly wrong. Every jump he now took through time sent him to a different timeline, including many nightmarish and unrecognisable worlds from his own. Right now, he was hiding behind a wall in a rubble-strewn, war-torn landscape akin to news coverage of wars in Africa and the Middle East. But this wasn't some far-flung hotspot. A broken sign covered in splattered mud and flecks of blood hung askew at an angle next to the bombed-out buildings all around him, betraying his true location. Little Clarendon Street, in Oxford. The sun was rising, and he had been running and hiding all night. It didn't matter how far he ran, or in which direction. There was no escape. Wherever he went, the sound of machine gun fire peppered by screams of the dying could be heard all around him. The air was choking him, thick from the incessant shelling. The latest explosion had been way too close for comfort, mere meters away, leaving him gasping for air as he was showered with small stones, with the accompanying dust covering his clothes and eyebrows. Exhausted, his strength was almost gone. Although he had made every effort to keep fit for his travels through time, his 53-year-old body just didn't have any more to give. Sweat poured from his brow as he clutched the tachyometer, willing it to charge faster, desperately needing the power indicator to turn green. Only then could he escape this world and move on to the next. He just prayed that this time he would find some semblance of normality, as he couldn't go on like this much longer. Breathing a sigh of relief through the dusty air as the light went green, he held out the wand in front of him to open the time bubble. He had no way of controlling where it would take him. That luxury had been lost when it became irretrievably damaged. Now he was at the mercy of its seemingly random whim to send him into any one of what could be potentially millions of different universes. Just as he was about to step through the bubble, a soldier came around the corner. It wasn't one of the British soldiers he had seen earlier. He hadn't seen any of them for hours. This one looked every inch like one of the ISIS fighters he had seen so often on the news on TV in his youth. Covered in perspiration and with a fevered, fanatical look in his eyes, the soldier shouted something in a language Josh didn't understand and raised his gun, ready to dispatch a hail of bullets towards him. Terrified, Josh leapt forward just as the man fired. Then he vanished, disappearing into the bubble a split second before the bullets reached him, leaving one rather confused fighter behind. Chapter 1. July 2040. England in the 2030s had been very different from the previous decade. 100 years before, the Wall Street crash had seen the prosperous 1920s give way to a decade of economic gloom. Almost a century to the day later, another catastrophic event struck the world. This time, it was not a financial meltdown that had brought about the downturn, but an unforeseen climate event. An asteroid strike had blanketed the world in dust, blocking out the sun and stripping away the effects of decades of global warming. A devastating winter followed, bringing Britain to its knees. With snowfall on a scale unprecedented in recorded history, power supplies failed, food became scarce, and law and order broke down. The population found themselves fighting to survive, not only against the cold, but also against each other. Over 2 million people died in Britain during what was to become known as the Black Winter. This bleak title had been bestowed with the Black Death in mind, the last time nature had caused such devastating loss of life. Many more people had fled abroad, never to return. They had been desperate to escape the Arctic conditions that had gripped northern Europe in late 2029. Although conditions eventually abated the following spring, many were in no hurry to return, believing it to be only a temporary respite. Sensationalist media stories that the world was on the brink of a new ice age abounded, and few wanted to risk returning to face it all over again the following winter. Those fears proved unfounded, but the cost of the Black Winter to Britain had been incalculable. Quite aside from the human loss, the country's livestock had been almost totally wiped out. Many native species of wild animals and insects simply hadn't evolved to cope with conditions of such severity. Their populations had been decimated and would take decades to recover. The landscape was desolate, devoid not just of crops, but also trees, many ancient oaks and other species killed by the months of cold. Even the hardiest of Britain's plant life had little defence against the devastating cold. The following summer, the growing season never got started. The frost had penetrated so deep into the ground that it remained frozen, even into July. Although the following winter was not as devastating as feared, it was still much colder and longer than average, so the harvest the following year was very poor. This set the pattern for the years ahead, as a succession of very cold winters and cool, wet summers put even more pressure on Britain. The country was in shock and had been left in a mess. It took years to restore all the transport links and public services to their previous levels, by which time the country was effectively bankrupt. The resulting depression made the Great Depression of the 1930s look relatively benign. With so little homegrown food available, the government had had no choice but to import heavily from unaffected Australia and New Zealand, as well as southern Europe. Rationing had to be reintroduced for the first time since the post-war austerity era. This was something very few still alive could remember. Some countries sought to take advantage of the situation, exploiting their advantage in a desire to punish Britain for leaving the European Union a decade before. This led to angry scenes in Parliament and recriminations all round from those who said that Britain should never have gone down the Brexit route. Australia and New Zealand, by comparison, were only too happy to help, the additional exports to Britain boosting their thriving economies still further. Regardless of the politics of the situation, by 2035, Britain was in a mess. The climate was still around 2 degrees cooler than it had been a decade before, and this was continuing to have a major effect on farming. The growing season was starting weeks later than before, with vulnerable crops at risk from frosts far later than had previously been the case. It was clearly going to be a long time before agriculture would get back to anywhere near normal. Britain had become so reliant on its infrastructure and technology that the people were seriously crippled by the sudden change of circumstances. Power lines and cables had been destroyed during the Big Freeze. Roads and railways had been severely damaged, with huge potholes that took years to repair and hundreds of miles of buckled, unusable rails. Internet access, on which so much depended, was non-existent for several months and then unreliable for a good couple of years after that. During the 2020s, internet radio had completely replaced FM and DAB, just as digital TV had replaced analogue a couple of decades earlier. This left the country in a situation where, if the internet was down, nothing worked, and many people simply didn't know what was going on a lot of the time. There was a great deal of civil unrest as a result. Again, the government was blamed, with many criticising the decision to shut down all of the BBC's FM transmitters. A few enterprising individuals restarted what had once been known as pirate radio, playing old-fashioned vinyl records to a small band of followers who had dusted down their ancient radios. Others built their own crystal sets before the retailers caught on and started selling traditional radios again. The resurgence of this seemingly archaic equipment was a stark reminder of the dangers of relying too much on technology. Had the Black Winter occurred 50 or 100 years before, it would most likely have had a far less devastating impact. Britain was more agricultural then and would have had plenty of local grown produce stored for the winter. People knew how to store potatoes, apples and other staples in those times. Back then, before the dawn of the superstore and 24-hour shopping, people didn't take it for granted that they could just nip to Tesco's for whatever they wanted all year round. Also, back then, many more houses still had working fireplaces. People would have been able to forage for firewood to keep warm. Communities would have been able to work together far more effectively, relying on what they produced locally, just as they had done throughout history. Britain had suffered more than most European countries. People further north, in Scandinavia, were used to harsh winters and had weathered the storm fairly well. Elsewhere, on mainland Europe, people had been able to travel south more easily to escape the worst. In Britain's case, that hadn't been so easy. The sea, so often its protector, this time became a barrier. Many died attempting to sail across it using inadequate boats. There were scenes reminiscent of the deaths in the Mediterranean during the migrant crisis earlier in the century. If they had been able to wait a little longer, they could have walked across it. By February 2030, with temperatures on the south coast averaging -20 degrees, the English Channel had frozen over completely for the first time since the last ice age. But it was too late. By then, those that had tried to make their escapes had already made it, perished in the attempt, or given up and sought shelter inland. As the 2030s wore on, eventually things began to improve. Having thrown herself on the mercy of the rest of Europe, Britain had received the assistance she needed, amid much political wrangling. Satirical European magazines enjoyed a field day with the UK's plight, lampooning the British in sketches and cartoons. One picture from a Paris-based magazine became famous the world over. It depicted a stereotypical bowler-hatted businessman on his hands and knees holding out a begging bowl. The accompanying caption translated as, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" At home, a coalition government had put their differences aside and decided to work together for the good of the country. Neither politicians nor people at home had the heart to argue any longer about whether EU membership was a good or a bad thing. They just wanted to be sure they could put food on the table. In the early years, they frequently couldn't, and the sight of long queues outside soup kitchens became a depressing sight on the streets of many cities, particularly in the harder-hit north and Scotland. Then, for the first time in 6 years, Britain had a hot summer in 2035. This lifted spirits and produced the first set of decent crops since the disaster. By the following winter, which was mercifully mild and snow-free, things were just about returning to some semblance of normality. The buses and trains were running, not always on time, but then they hadn't been much better before the disaster. Electricity supplies and internet access were both reliable again, and at last the country was growing enough food to cut down on expensive imports. Despite repeated criticism of Britain's reliance on technology being a major cause of it ending up in such a mess, ultimately technological advances played a big part in the recovery. Incredible developments in robotics had continued apace elsewhere in the world, whilst Britain had been in the recovery position. Investing in some of this new technology, the farming industry was now able to unleash a fleet of robotic bees, designed to do the job that the severely depleted native bee population was struggling with. Coated in a special sticky gel, the robotic bees were programmed to land on flowering crops, allowing pollen grains to stick lightly to the gel before being rubbed off on the next flower visited. Developments such as these were part of a robotic revolution which was transforming the world as it headed towards the mid-21st century. It was clear that robots were going to play a huge role in future society, with every role from cleaner to sex worker being carried out by increasingly complex artificially intelligent machines. Despite the assistance that this new robotic army was bringing, the mood of the people remained that Britain must learn from the mistakes of the past. Listening to the people, for once, the government vowed that it would make Britain self-sufficient again. They invested large sums in farming, incentivising the industry with tax breaks, making it an attractive career option again. For the first time in generations, the amount of Britain's acreage given over to farming began to increase, attracting young people into the business. Although robots were utilised on the farms, the humans running the farms ensured they had a plan B in place in the event of any future apocalyptic scenario developing. There was no longer any pressure from town planners to build on any of the existing farmland, as Britain no longer had a housing crisis. With a few million less inhabitants than before, there was suddenly an abundance of housing stock. The lack of demand also meant that for the first time in a long time, people could actually afford to buy them. Even with the increasing use of robots, there was no shortage of work to go round repairing the damage done by the Black Winter. Many of Britain's workers rediscovered the joys of manual labour, repairing and putting right the damage that had been done. They didn't complain. They were being well paid for it by a government desperate to get the country back on track. With money in people's pockets, suddenly there was a feel-good factor around again. Britain had been through a lot, but in many ways, the people were happier than they had been before. Many remembered their grandparents talking about the spirit of the Blitz. Now they were discovering for themselves the camaraderie that came with pulling together in the face of adversity. Against all odds, Britain began to prosper again as the decade drew to a close. It remained a very different world to the one it had been 10 years earlier, but the general consensus was this was a good thing. What none of the people knew was that, for some, it really was a different world. For one woman in particular, decisions made during that fateful winter led to two possible outcomes, one in which she lived and one in which she died. Chapter 2. July 2040. Lauren Watson awoke with a start, feverish and sweaty from the recurring nightmare that had once again gripped her during the night. She sat up, her black bob of hair falling into shape around her cute rounded face. She was in her late 30s now, but didn't look much different from the schoolgirl she had once been. Her body's only concession to age was the few extra pounds she had acquired over the years. She looked around the room, reassuring herself that everything was normal. The familiar, cluttered mess in which she lived quickly helped her return to a state of calm, but the memory of the dream still lingered. Lauren was in her bedroom, above the Red Lion pub, which she had run for the past 10 years. It was an old building, standing on the town's main street since the 17th century, and it showed. Her room was in serious need of redecoration. There were large cracks in the wall, which had appeared some years ago, possibly as a result of damage caused by the freezing weather a decade earlier. The once white paint was yellowing with age, and there were cobwebs in the corners. Her clothes were strewn all over the floor, and the small window facing down to the street below was filthy on both sides. It left the room in a permanent state of gloom, even when it was sunny outside. Tidiness and cleanliness had never been Lauren's strong points. Climbing out of bed, she made her way through to the small kitchen in search of coffee and toast, tripping over a pair of shoes she had left by the bedroom door on her way. The Red Lion was the only pub remaining in a town that had once had dozens. Pubs up and down the country had closed in their droves in the first 3 decades of the century. A smoking ban, cheap beer from supermarkets, and ever-increasing advances in home entertainment had rendered pubs redundant for all but the most hardened drinkers. This pub had survived, largely because of its excellent restaurant, run by former landlady Debbie Kent. She and her husband were long gone now. They had left for Cyprus just before the Black Winter, leaving Lauren in temporary charge. It was a position she had never relinquished. After the horrors of that winter, during which Lauren had nearly lost her life, she had eventually returned to live in the pub, even though it remained closed for almost a year afterwards. She simply didn't have anywhere else to go. Her mother was dead, and she had long ago lost contact with her father. When the pub did eventually reopen, she was pleasantly surprised by the amount of trade it did. People in the community had a renewed need to bond together after all that had happened, and the pub was the perfect place to do it. With the country's financial systems in disarray, Lauren took over the running of the place on a largely cash basis. This was something quite quaint by the standards of an era in which contactless payments had become the norm. In the aftermath of the crisis, people had once again found a fondness for cash. It seemed safer and more real in a world where so much had become uncertain. From Debbie and Richard Kent, she had heard nothing. After a while, she had just assumed they must be dead. No one had ever questioned her right to be there or come to claim ownership of the lease. So she'd just carried on as before, acting as if she owned the place, even though she didn't have a scrap of documentation to support that claim. She used her considerable charms to blag a local brewery into giving her credit until she had enough cash to be self-sufficient and never looked back. Her newfound popularity and local status bestowed on her with an award from the honours system also gave her an air of authenticity. Her OBE was awarded for the many lives she had saved running a refuge at an abandoned army camp during the Black Winter. It was a pretty decent life now, apart from the nightmares. They all stemmed back to those dark winter days, in particular the terrifying events of Halloween 2029. That was the day she had first been taken to the camp. It was being run by her nemesis since school days, the misogynistic, racist and all-round nasty piece of work, Daniel Fisher. His men had captured her while she was foraging for food in an abandoned supermarket and forced her to go back to the base against her will. On arrival, she had been frog-marched in to see Dan in his office. Then she was left alone in his clutches as he tried to force himself on her in revenge for years of spurning his advances. Then something seriously strange had happened. Something she still couldn't adequately explain to this day. Threatened with a gun, and with Dan attempting to rape her, the situation had been pretty desperate. Then another man had entered the room and intervened, pushing Dan out of the way. Lauren, temporarily freed, had grabbed the gun in panic and in her tormented state had turned it upon Dan and fired. It was only then that she got a proper look at the face of her rescuer. He looked exactly like Dan, only older, and was clearly horrified at seeing the younger Dan shot at point-blank range. As if that wasn't weird enough, she then thought she caught a glimpse of her ex-boyfriend Josh looking in through the window of the hut. It was only a split-second glimpse, but she remembered that he too looked much older. Turning back, she saw the older Dan, who had come to her salvation, vanish before her eyes. When she looked back to the window, the image of Josh was gone too. The whole turn of events had been so quick, a matter of a few seconds, and so traumatic, she was unsure how much of it had really happened the way she thought she remembered it. She knew that the mind could play strange tricks on itself in times of extreme stress, and had become convinced over the years that she had hallucinated much of it. Perhaps it was all some sort of defence mechanism to divert her attention away from the fact that she had killed a man, even one as odious and deserving of it as Dan. And now it was her sleeping, subconscious mind that was playing tricks on her. Over and over in her dreams, the events of that fateful day played again and again, but with one crucial difference. In the dream, there was always a different outcome. In her sleeping version of events, there was no mysterious Dan lookalike coming to her aid or anyone at the window. In this reality, she was destined to find no salvation. Dan attacked her with the same result every time. She always fell, hitting her head and killing herself in the fall. Even though she always knew it was coming, she remained powerless within the dreamland to prevent it. Sometimes the dream went further, and she could picture her body lying cold and lifeless in the woods, the blood that had seeped from her fractured skull quickly freezing on the snowy ground. For years, she had remained traumatised by this, so much so that she had kept it to herself, not even confiding in Kaylee, her closest friend. By avoiding thinking about it in her waking hours and getting on with life, she had hoped that the dreams would eventually fade. But if anything, the opposite was happening. The nightmares were growing stronger and becoming more frequent now that she had reached the point where she felt she was going to have to talk to someone. It was affecting her sleep so badly that she had recently lost a relationship because of it. After years of drifting in and out of relationships with mostly men, and occasionally women, she had met a girl she really liked a few months before. Amber was young and pretty, with gorgeous red hair that fitted her name, something Lauren had always found desirable in both sexes. Amber had come into the pub for the evening with her friends, and when Lauren had started flirting with her, the girl had flirted back. When Lauren asked her if she was a natural ginger, the cheeky freckled girl had suggestively replied, "Well, there's only one way you're going to find out." Lauren instinctively felt a connection, and from that moment onwards, it was a foregone conclusion she would be taking Amber upstairs at the end of the night. Running a pub had been good for Lauren's sex life. She didn't need to go out to find partners. They came to her. Being in charge of the pub gave her a certain appeal. In addition to her popularity as a local heroine, she could pretty much have whoever she wanted, and had certainly taken advantage over the years. Some people had labelled her a slapper, particularly when she fell out with certain customers. This inevitably happened from time to time when people had to be removed from the pub for their behaviour, calling her all sorts on their forced ejection. But none of their comments fazed Lauren. She was just a young, single woman enjoying her body and prided herself that she had never cheated on a partner during the occasional spells when she was actually in a relationship. With Amber, what had started as a one-night stand developed into something more when her new flame simply didn't go home the next day. When Lauren got up to the smell of cooking bacon and found Amber in the kitchen making breakfast in just her bra and panties, she knew she was on to a good thing. There was quite an age gap between them. Amber was only 22, some 15 years younger than Lauren, but it didn't bother either of them. For a few months they were blissfully happy, but then Lauren's night terrors got worse. Her endless nightmares and screaming during the night began to unsettle the younger woman. In addition, Lauren's poor sleep quality and resultant irritability made her highly volatile during the day. She began to take it out on Amber, pushing away the young girl who had grown to idolise her. Eventually, and inevitably, they split up. She hadn't seen Amber since the day she left, 3 months before, and there had been no communication between them either. Now Lauren was alone again, with no one to hold at night and reassure her that everything was going to be okay. As she sat alone in the kitchen where Amber had once made her fry-ups, surrounded by the previous day's washing up, she munched on a piece of toast and reflected on the situation. There was no getting away from it. With no signs that the dreams were going away any time soon, she just couldn't keep it to herself any longer. Her lifelong friends were meeting up that evening for a meal. The Time Bubble team, as they liked to call themselves, had an important matter to discuss. This would be as good a time as any to seek their support. It had been ages since she had seen some of them, and perhaps they could help her find some answers. Her ex-boyfriend, Josh, in particular, might be able to help. He had theories about more or less everything, and hopefully that would include dreams. She could also mention seeing his face at the window. Perhaps that was her mind's way of suggesting speaking to him for help. His wife probably wouldn't like it, but Lauren couldn't help that. What went on between Lauren and Josh was almost 20 years ago, and Alice needed to get over it. If he couldn't help, or just took the piss, as was perfectly possible, Kaylee surely could, even if only to provide a shoulder to cry on. The two of them had known each other since reception class, and Kaylee understood her better than anyone else in the world. The two of them had led very different lives when it came to relationships and sex. Kaylee was very much a one-man woman, but these differences had never been a problem. In fact, during their teenage years, their differing views had been a great help to each other as they charted the rocky path to adulthood. As it transpired, her friends were not the only old faces she was destined to see today. Just as she was finishing her breakfast, she heard a loud banging on the front door. She glanced at the clock above the kitchen table. It was just past 10 o'clock. "Who the hell's that at this time?" questioned Lauren out loud. It was still nearly an hour until opening time. She had nearly finished her toast. There was only the centre, crust-free piece left. Since childhood, she had always eaten around the outside first, saving her middle, favourite piece until last. Shoving the remainder in rather too quickly, leaving a smear of Marmite on her lower lip, she leapt up and headed for the curving narrow staircase that led to the pub downstairs. Lifting the hatch that allowed access to the bar, she walked across the ancient stone flagstones, opened the heavy wooden door, and was shocked to see a familiar face waiting to greet her on the other side. "Kent!" she exclaimed, instantly recognising the chubby ex-policeman and her ex-employer at the front door. "I thought you were dead." "That's charming," said the pub's former landlord, as he stood framed in the doorway, the brilliant sunlight shining down on his now almost bald head. He looked much older, unsurprisingly, but also very well. He had a deep tan, not the sort you got in Britain, especially during the past decade. "Can I come in?" he asked. "It is my pub after all." Reluctantly, she moved to one side and ushered him in. Although part of her was pleased to see him again, she was filled with a feeling of apprehension. Had he come back to stake his claim to what was, by rights, his property? "Relax," he said. "I haven't come to evict you. Make me a cup of coffee and I'll explain all. By the way, do you know you got Marmite on your face?" He was the same old Kent, all right, ordering her about. "Get me a coffee, Lauren. Chop some logs, Lauren." It had never stopped when he was her boss. Despite all that, she had developed a certain fondness for him over the years. He was a buffoon, but a somewhat lovable one. And even when he was bad-tempered and bossy, he was worth having around for comedy value. Kent excused himself to go to the toilet, explaining that he had had a long journey, while she busied herself with the filter machine. It was 10 minutes before he returned, and when he did, they settled down with 2 cups of coffee at the bar. Then Kent explained what had happened after he'd gone to Cyprus. "When the Black Winter hit, there was no question of us even considering coming back any time soon. We had family in Cyprus. Deb's sister and her husband had been expats there for years and ran a restaurant in Paphos. We stayed with them for a while, and both started working in the restaurant. We couldn't get in contact with home at all. None of the BBC TV channels were broadcasting, and CNN and Fox were focusing on the problems in America. It seemed as if England was completely cut off." "We were," said Lauren. "Go on." "Our biggest worry was obviously the kids, but thankfully they turned up safe and sound in Cyprus a few weeks after we got there. They'd managed to get out on foot through the Channel Tunnel. A lot of people escaped that way, apparently. They knew we'd gone to Paphos on holiday and decided to follow us there." "So how come you never came back?" asked Lauren, "or even tried to contact me?" "I tried a few times during that first year, but couldn't get through on the phone or internet." "All of that was down for months," replied Lauren. "In fact, it was years before it was running reliably again." "So it seems," said Kent. "By the time things seemed to be getting back to normal here, we'd got quite settled in Cyprus. Debs loved working in the restaurant. She said cooking all the local dishes made a nice change from roast dinners and fish and chips, so she wanted to stay on. By all accounts, England was in a mess, and I had no desire to come back either, especially with the amazing weather we were enjoying over there." "So, where is Debs now?" asked Lauren. Kent's face fell, and Lauren guessed what he was about to say before he said it. "She died," he replied. "It was a heart attack. About 3 months ago. She enjoyed her food a bit too much, even with that healthy Mediterranean diet. After a while, I decided I didn't really want to stay on in Cyprus on my own, so it seemed like the right time to come home." "I'm sorry to hear about Debs," said Lauren. "So what are your plans now?" "Well, as you probably already figured out, I would like to take the pub on again," said Kent. "That's all very well," replied Lauren, "but this is my home. And what about all the work I've put into this place?" "Or, looking at it another way, how about all the back rent you owe me?" challenged Kent. "You've been living here scot-free for the past 10 years. "And I've kept your business going for you," retorted Lauren. "This is the only pub left in town, and it would have gone the way of the others if I hadn't worked bloody hard to keep it afloat." "That's a reasonable point," conceded Kent. "Don't worry. I told you I wasn't about to throw you out. The thing is, I don't want to take it on all by myself anyway. Not at my age. I'm going to be 64 next month. I don't need all the stress at my time of life. What do you think about us cutting a deal to run the place together?" "I want half the profits," replied Lauren. "I'm sure we can work something out," replied Kent. "Now, tell me, how are things going here? I did a bit of homework online before I came back, and it looks like you're doing well, judging by the reviews you're getting." "I am doing well," said Lauren. "That's why I want a fair cut. I'm not blowing my own trumpet, but this place would be nothing without me." Kent paused for a minute, summing up what Lauren had said. She had stated her position pretty strongly, and he knew what she had said was true. He would be foolish to risk losing her. Far better to agree to her terms, let her have half the money and let her do most of the work. Then he could have a relatively easy life, and more importantly, devote his time to what he had really come home for. He had unfinished business in the town with a long-lost love. It may only have been 3 months since Debs died, but he didn't have time to waste at his age. "You've got yourself a deal. Put it there, partner," he said in a lame attempt at a Wild West accent. He held out his hand to seal the deal. She took it, not particularly enjoying the handshake. His palms seemed a bit sweaty, and an unpleasant thought went through her head, bearing in mind his lengthy toilet visit. I hope he washed his hands afterwards. "I assume there is room at the inn?" asked Kent. "I was planning to move back in." "That's fine," said Lauren, not particularly relishing being housemates with Kent, but realising its practicalities. "But let's get one thing clear. This is strictly a business arrangement. Don't get any funny ideas." Loose as Lauren generally was with her morals, she had no intention of hooking up with Kent. Somehow that just seemed wrong, and she was rarely short of offers from elsewhere. "Fine by me," said Kent. His romantic aspirations lay elsewhere, and he had no intention of confiding them to Lauren. "Plus, I'm used to having my freedom when it comes to my personal life," added Lauren. "If I want to take someone upstairs, I don't want any moral objections or complaints about noise." "Don't worry about it," replied Kent, who was under no illusion about what Lauren was like. It was one of the reasons he had employed her in the first place. He knew that she pulled in the punters. Business concluded, he decided it was time to change the subject. "So, what's happened to all the old gang?" asked Kent. "Is Andy still about?" The mention of Andy brought a flicker of pain to Lauren's eyes. She hadn't thought about him for a while. He had been the pub's resident alcoholic and a substantial contributor to its turnover for many years. His death was something she still felt guilty about. She had sent him out in the snow, not quite realising how bad conditions were at the start of the black winter. It had been the last time she had ever seen him. Many months later, he was found, buried in a melting snowdrift, an empty bottle of expensive malt whisky by his side. She had never forgiven herself and had felt all the more guilty after receiving the OBE that she hadn't let him stay. Kent didn't need to know about any of that, though. "No, he died," she replied. "He fell over drunk in the snow and froze to death." "Why does that not surprise me?" said Kent. Then he asked the question he really wanted the answer to. "What about Kay? Have you seen her?" Kay was Kent's teenage love interest, one with whom he had shared an intriguing adventure many years before when both had time-travelled into their own past. Lauren knew nothing of this, and that was the way he intended to keep it. So it seemed they both had secrets they wanted to keep from each other. "I haven't seen her in the flesh for years. I don't know if she still lives around here," replied Lauren. "However, I have seen her on the TV, would you believe? She's one of the presenters on that show, The New Australia. Have you seen it?" Kent hadn't, but he was going to make sure that he did as soon as he got the chance. The two of them continued catching up on old times until they were interrupted by further banging on the door. Lauren looked up, noticing the time on the old-fashioned analogue clock behind the bar. "Bloody hell, it's 11:10. That'll be the pensioners wanting their coffee. Come on, you can give me a hand." Lauren was starting as she meant to go on. She was determined that there was going to be no bossing her about anymore if they were going to be partners. If anything, the boot was going to be on the other foot. They opened the door and half a dozen or so senior citizens shuffled in slowly. Many remembered Kent and expressed their surprise at seeing him again. They didn't seem unhappy about it, which encouraged him. Once they were settled with their coffee in their usual seats by the bay window that faced the street, Lauren turned her attention back to Kent. "By the way, I'm going out for a meal with some friends tonight," she began. "So you can look after the place for me. It's only Tuesday, so it shouldn't be too strenuous. It will give you a chance to get back into the swing of things." "Hey," protested Kent. "Who's in charge here?" "We both are," said Lauren. "Remember, you've been away a long time. A lot of things have changed. Until you get back up to speed, it's probably best you follow my lead." "Whatever you say, boss," said Kent sarcastically. It didn't look like much had changed to him. A pub was a pub. How hard could it be? Pulling a few pints, sticking the money in the till. "Now then," he added, "I've got all my stuff in the car out the front. Where should I put it?" "The room at the back overlooking the garden's free," replied Lauren. "You can have that." Lauren knew that room was tiny, but there was no way she was giving up the large room at the front. "I was kind of hoping to get my old room back," said Kent, obviously meaning hers. "Let's be honest, Kent," she said. "Who is more likely to need a double bed these days? Me or you? It's me, isn't it? And at least down at the back of the pub, you'll get a bit of peace and quiet, you know, when I'm entertaining." It wasn't actually that sort of screaming she was worried about. She didn't want him to hear her having her nightmares. Kent didn't reply, but just shrugged his shoulders. It was obvious from his body language that he couldn't think of a response. "I rest my case," she said. "Now, you had better get your stuff in, as the lunchtime crowd will be in here soon, and I could use a hand." He didn't argue, heading back out of the front door to collect whatever belongings he had left in his car. Lauren was pleased with the way things had gone. This ought to work out very nicely. She was in charge, and she was going to make sure it stayed that way. With everything sorted on the home front, she was now ready to turn her attention to the evening ahead. Her mind was made up. It was time to tell the others about her dreams.